Hello there, this is video 2 in our series of videos designed to give you some tips and tricks of using Fluid Designer for 3D printing in order to make the best use of the application. We strongly recommend you look at video 1 and not just videos 2 and 3. So in video 1 we looked at don't use the save command, consider all preloaded files as template files, try and keep your objects as curves wherever possible. Click the group library button in the browser panel to refresh your folder list. Always apply the scale. Do Control A and apply the scale, otherwise you'll have problems when sizing your objects in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. Now the first thing I want to look at in this video is 3D template masters. Add cross sections to an empty template, an empty document. That's what we want to look at first of all. So if we go to Fluid Designer for 3D printing, so if I just go to File and New, and if we actually start off with a blank document, so I'll just switch on screencast keys. So we've got a blank document there with no files on it. What you see in the outliner panel here is just this object, Fluid Designer for 3D printing, which is just an empty file that I had to introduce in order to maintain the integrity of Fluid Designer for 3D printing. Try not to delete that, it could mess up your system if you do. But essentially there are no files in this system, so if you add a curve, so if we add a NURBS circle for example, and just open up the toolbox, and if I just change the radius of this to say 10 millimeters, that's a NURBS curve, but I haven't got any objects to wrap around it. I've got no bevel objects, no cross sections. Well, where can we add them to our new file here? Well, if we click on Group Library, 3D template masters and 3D template masters less than 1 millimeter are the places to look. So if I just go to 3D template masters, so in there's a bracelet file which you can open up. There's a ring file which you can open up, and then there are some triangular cross sections, rectangular cross sections, pentagonal cross sections, octagonal and hexagonal, and circular cross sections. Now the one that I tend to use most of is the rectangular cross sections, and the way to bring those into any new document is to identify where they are. So it's rectangular cross sections in the 3D templates masters folder, and we always append in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. So if we go to File and Append, always go up through the menu system until you get to the Groups folder, and then these are all the folders with the patterns and objects on your system. And connectors, masters and 3D templates cross sections, they're available in the free version of Fluid Designer for 3D printing. So if you go to 3D templates masters, and I'm going to use the rectangular cross sections, and it's always the objects that we append. So these are all the various cross sections in there, and if I just press the A key on the keyboard to select all, and then if I hold down the Shift key and just switch off the default object, I don't want to import that into my current workspace, I just want all of these cross sections. So if we append those from the library, you'll see that they now appear in our outliner panel, and our NURBS circle is the object that we've got here. So we can now apply a cross section to our NURBS circle. So that is now 1 millimeter deep and 1 millimeter thick, and we can see the Z value here, that's the blue direction, is 1 millimeter. And we can change it to 2 millimeters thick, 4 millimeters, etc. So we've now got our parametric smart object. That's essentially what the NURBS curve is, and we're applying different cross sections to it and we've imported these rectangular cross sections from the 3D templates master folder. If you wanted triangular cross sections, you could append them from there. If you wanted pentagonal cross sections, you can append them from that file. So I'll just very quickly just do that. File and append. So if I just go up through the menu system, so it's 3D templates masters, which is where you find all these cross sections. If I want to use the pentagonal ones, go to object. Now there's not very many of those, as you can see, compared to the rectangular ones. Don't import the, don't append the default object. So pentagonal ones. So if I highlight my NURBS circle now and go to cross sections, if I go to the pentagonal cross section, not quite as clear to see as the rectangular one, but if I export that, or if I convert it to a mesh, it is actually a 5-sided object. Let me just convert it to a mesh and you'll probably be able to see. Yeah, we can see it a bit better there if I convert it to a mesh and go into edit mode. Alright, so it's got five sides to that as the cross section. 5 sides, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that's the pentagonal cross section. Come out of edit mode. If I just do Control Z, go back to a curve. More common to use are the rectangular and the circular cross sections than the pentagonal. But that's where you'll find them. 3D templates masters. Not under cross sections. Cross sections is a little bit different. If I just briefly go to that, cross sections are actually, if I just drag and drop these onto the workspace, cross sections are actually objects like this, where a bit more like kind of pottery type objects, if you like, where you can create objects based upon this profile curve along the left hand side. Profile curve on the left hand side. Okay, so I've just talked about 3D template masters, which is where you can find cross sections to add to an empty document. Now the next thing that I want to talk about is the surface finish of your objects and how you can improve the surface finish of an object. Well, the first thing that I would advise is to use NURBS curves instead of Bezier curves. Now if I go back to Fluid Designer for 3D printing, these objects that are in the 3D template cross sections, these are in fact Bezier curves. Now we can tell that they're Bezier curves if I just hide the circle cross section first of all. This object down the side here is the profile curve. And what's happening with these 3D template cross section files is that the profile curve is being wrapped around in a circle to create a solid object here. So this is what's called a lathing function. If you think of a traditional lathe which is used to create nuts and bolts, or you can have a wooden lathe which will create circular legs for a table, for example. That, or if you also consider creating pottery using your hands are the lathing tool. If you were to create a piece of pottery, such as a mug or a jug, for example, and essentially what you're doing is repeating this pattern, this profile pattern, this profile curve, and you're throwing it around a circle to create an object. Now these two curves here, both of them are actually Bezier curves. And if I go into edit mode, and if I press the A key on the keyboard to highlight all of the control points along the side there, one of the features of Bezier Curves is that I can set the handle type to be a vector. You can't do that with NURBS Curves. And when I select a vector one, you can see one of the features of Bezier Curves is that I can get straight lines here. So if you want to create objects which have got an angular feature to them, a straight line feature to them, then the thing to do is to use Bezier Curves. And these here, Bezier Curve and Bezier Circle, are the two objects that are used here. So if I press the A key on the keyboard to select them all again, and if I hit the right mouse button and change the angle type to automatic, you can see I then get a more rounded object. Now, once you've actually finished creating your object in as a Bezier curve here, if you actually go to Tools, Object Tools and convert it to a mesh, and then press the Tab key on the keyboard, we can see how the mesh is made up using the Bezier curve there. Now, the number of faces of this object is about 9,500, approximately 9,408. If I do Control Z and take it back to being a curve again, and if I press the Tab key on the keyboard to go into edit mode, and press the space bar and type set spline type, I can change my curve from being a Bezier curve to a NURBS curve. And if I do the same for the profile curve on the side there, if we go into edit mode, set spline type and change that to a NURBS curve as well, notice how things change there. The profile's changed, and if I click the right mouse button and set handle type to vector now, nothing will happen. One of the features about NURBS curves is that they are always rounded. You can't get that straight line angular function that you can get with a Bezier curve. So I've just changed these to NURBS curves now from Bezier curves. Things look to be the same, but they're not quite the same because we can't change it to a vector type. And we also can't go to set the spline type. We can't change it back to a Bezier now. It won't do that. You can change from Bezier to NURBS, but you can't go back to Bezier. If I try that, no conversion is possible. So one of the things you need to be aware of is that once you've changed something to a NURBS curve, you can't go backwards. Now if we now change this object to a mesh, we've got slightly more faces in this than before. We've got 9,200, slightly more. Not so many in this instance. But if I switch objects here, and if I actually, if I go to File and New, okay, so if I go to File and New, now if I go to Bracelets, and if I just scroll down here, now a lot of these bracelets are in fact constructed using Bezier curves. And if I just zoom in on this, you'll see when we get very close, you can see we've got kind of straight sections here. It's not perfectly rounded. And if I just select my count down to 1 here and just press the Tab key on the keyboard and view it from the front and just click the Home button, you can see there's a lot of control points there. And when this was made, it was made using Bezier curves. And if I do, with all the control points highlighted, if I press the space bar and set spline type again, and if I change this to NURBS, if you look at the pattern, you'll see that it rounds off. We've got a much smoother surface there now. If I just do Control Z to undo that and just zoom in, you can see we've got kind of straight lines here. As we change the spline type to NURBS, you'll see that it rounds off and it smooths off the surface. Now, one of the downsides to that is it will increase the number of faces. So if I change this to, if I increase that back to 14, which is where it was before, you can see it's really slowing down my computer, because we've got something like 273,000 faces for each one of these objects, so we've got 14 times that. So we've got a very smooth surface finish on our bracelet here, but we've got a lot of faces to take into account. So there is a bit of a trade-off. Sometimes you do need to stick to using Bezier curves when you've got a lot of replication of an object. Sometimes you can stick to it being, you need to stick to it to being a Bezier curve to keep the face count down. Alright, so you can improve the surface quality by changing it from a Bezier curve to a NURBS curve, but there is a trade-off in that you're going to end up with a lot of faces, and if you're uploading to Shapeways, you may exceed their limit if you do that. So you do need to take that into account, and you do need to remember you can't easily convert back from a NURBS curve to a Bezier curve. You can just do Control Z, but not using the normal commands. Alright, so there is that trade-off, but for the highest quality, try wherever possible to using NURBS curves. And if you look at any of the objects that have been created in the patterns folders, right, so any of these objects here, like the Harrington fonts and the other fonts, for example, these are actually all NURBS curve objects. Now, it's not easy to see that from just opening them up. Yeah. There's no simple way of doing that, I mean, other than sort of trying to convert it from one to the other. Alright, when it comes to things like these jewellery design objects, where you see this kind of feature, then, you know, they are likely to be Bezier curves rather than NURBS curves. Okay, so use NURBS instead of Bezier wherever you can. Add additional control points is another way of actually smoothing off the surface finish. And I'll talk about that in the next video, because this video is now up to about 20 minutes and I don't like to go beyond that really in each video. So add additional control points, smooth meshes with subdivide and smooth, and use a subsurf modifier. I'll discuss that in the next video.